much, Laura. Thank you very much, Laura, and everyone involved with Magic for setting this up and getting it organized. And this is Alan Seiden, and thank you to Richard for, let's say, encouraging me on this. And it's really great to work with you on this presentation. It's an exciting thing, and the timing is right to talk about it. So just thank you, everyone, for joining and all the great comments we're getting on LinkedIn and everywhere. The Zen of PHP without Zend Server. Just a couple of introductions. First, here's me, Alan, principal at Seiden Group. We started this company to work with open source, really originally PHP and now all open source. But PHP is still near and dear to my heart. I helped create the PHP toolkit that let PHP call RPG and CL, COBOL as open source, and started Club Seiden, which was a way for, we met a lot of you I've met through the Club Seiden community. It's like bringing new people into the platform. And then we do a CIO summit. It's free twice a year. If we get back to doing conferences, that'll be twice a year for CIOs and IT directors to kind of talk about IBMI and have confidence and know how to speak to the business about IBMI. So I hope that comes back. Richard, well, he can add something, but he's a great guy. He's so versatile. He created our own RJS software. I knew him as the evil .NET guy before, but really it's so much. Works with Seiden.
I'm still evil.
You're still evil, okay. He's created this I Forget tool, which is a Git client. It works with SEU. You can keep doing, for those who still, we always encourage new practices, but those who use still SEU or something, you can use Git, store your source code, better than not storing your source code at all. It's really easy to use, I'll say that. I'm hearing nice things about it. And he's very versatile, does all kinds of different development. I love talking to him about anything that's on my mind. He just has so many ideas, including Python, works with PHP, anything. So how did I do there, Richard? Did I describe you?
Pretty good, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, and even, yep, absolutely, we can keep going.
Okay, great. And he works on some Seiden Group projects too. It's like Club Seiden, it's really nice. So little slide here, I'm just not too much self-promotion. Lots of cool people that you know here. So why PHP? It was really the first major open source scripting, so-called scripting language, mainstream one to come to the IBMI. I love net.data, which was ILE based and was kind of scripting, let me do some websites. And there were other things, Java, and you probably could use RPG also, but PHP was this mainstream one. I was looking for something, say 2004, looking for some language I could use that would work on the IBMI and that I knew would work on other platforms too. We're all thinking about our careers in some way or another, and even though we're devoted to IBMI, many of us, we like to know that we are capable on other platforms too, and PHP met that need. I knew I could use it elsewhere. I could practice with it on my own computer, then run it on the I later for production. And there was a great user group in New York City called NYC PHP. They even had some IBM people give talks. And there's a great community to help everybody get started. So I love that. I love being part of the IBMI world and something outside of it also. There's a funny picture here of this Mantis CD. That's courtesy of Ira. Ira Chandler put that together. That was the first, one of the early open source PHP projects on the I, where we took this open source product and we ported it so it worked with DB2, not just MySQL anymore. And that's some of the beauty of open source, that you have control, you have power, you have creativity and flexibility. So I still get a chuckle out of that. But anyway, there's just so much open source that runs on PHP. It's not just the language and what we can all do with it as individuals, but the whole community, content management systems, WordPress, Drupal, e-commerce. So there's just a ton that you can bring to the I or understand that runs not on the I, including this custom award-winning applications. Many of the award winners from the Common Conference were PHP ones. We had one, there was Mats Lidström did one for the radio royalties in Sweden and elsewhere. And you can continue to access your DB2 data, which grows and grows, RPG code, everything. We worked in the PHP toolkit that many of you I know use. But it's not just web pages and applications, it's web services and APIs. I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but all of you, I'm sure, either have created APIs or consumed them or are hearing about them somewhere in your company. We don't develop everything ourselves anymore. Many of the inquiries I get from clients are about APIs, either connected to credit card services or custom relationship systems, such as Salesforce and other ones. is just out there and just so much going on. So that's a major way that PHP has contributed, as well as converting green screens to websites. And here's I just showed a screenshot of some actual applications that a friend of mine did that I liked. But WordPress itself probably accounts for a ton of PHP usage. It's the newspapers, Star Wars, Beyonce, so many sites use it, and we're still working with it. We work with people who use WordPress for their front end because it provides a certain amount of security and standards. You could even use WordPress to connect to the IBM in the back also. So that's really interesting. PHP can also be called from RPG and CL and so forth. One reason is many API providers give out a software development kit that's written in PHP. They don't have an RPG version. They could, but they don't. So they provide that, might as well use it. So it makes it easy to get started. It feels like being in the mainstream. And that's also true now of Python, Node.js, and some other languages, but PHP was the one of the early ones. Gives you a lot of power. There's also, just like those other languages, it gives you components such as creating spreadsheets or PDF files. There's all these packages that exist already that you can use. You may want to call them from RPG or CL or something else. In fact, I remember when PHP came to the IBM I did an article, interviewed Andy Gutmans. The thing he was proud most of was that they had SOAP functionality built in. So now that sounds old, but at the time, knowing that web services were so key, that keep the IBM relevant. So I love that. I love keeping the IBM relevant. And then actually, if you go on the php.net manual site, it actually mentions the I in some places when talking about the database. So that's cool. As for a timeline, 2004, yes, I needed it. I needed PHP to be on, it was called the i5 at the time. I really needed it. I went to a community site, i5php.net. I wonder how many of you remember that, put up by Rob Ward. They had kind of like a homegrown PHP. It was not supported by anybody. It was a cool forum. It was missing the mail function, but it had ODBC connectivity. And it's a little bit like coming back to the future now with the very basic PHP that we can add on to and use. 2006, Zen Core came, IBM shipped it. Yes, and it included the mail function, and they had a paid extension that was Zen Platform, but Zen Core had the basics. Basically a Unix type PHP coming to the I have to give IBM credit for creating Pace, which is where all these Unix type applications can run. Later on, Zend Server, I believe that was the date. Open source PHP was available in Zend Server, plus administrative pages and some paid add-ons. So, which later became Basic, was the free one, Professional, Enterprise. And I have to thank Zend for everything they did there, bringing that to the IBM It really gave us a lot of new possibilities on the I. And now there's community PHP starting last year, based on RPMs. And what's an RPM? It's a format of installation that's very standard across the community, especially on Linux. It runs from like an SSH shell or any of those Unix shells, and it goes out to the hot repository and pulls down the code and installs it for you. The best thing is it knows what components need to be there, what prerequisites need to be there. It handles everything. Now, IBM itself is using that for many, many packages, including the Nginx web server, Node.js, and Python, curl. I remember the old days, if you find my old article on curl, I told you had to go to some website, full freeware or something. Like, it was crazy how you had to install this. Now it's so easy. IBM is doing this for us. They built the architecture. And so now it's just open source is coming faster and faster and faster. And RPM is one of those technologies that makes it just standardized to install software. We also have ODBC is back, which we'll talk more about later. It's an important part of this puzzle. Now, 2020, 2021, there was news that the Zend Server basic license is being withdrawn. That's essentially the free edition, no cost edition of Zend Server is being withdrawn. However, we do have time. There's time for a transition, either to upgrade and pay to go to a professional or enterprise, or move over to the RPMs, which is a free kind of industry standard way to do PHP. PHP really is widespread. People ask me, I was interviewed last week, and I said there's thousands. There's definitely are, because there just are. Even a little bit of PHP somewhere, even calling a web service, it's just everywhere. And then so many of us use it, and it still works really well. It's getting better and better. So RPM-based PHP to the rescue. IBM kind of had the idea, and Zend is hosting that, the community PHP. A very basic, like, you can't use any words anymore. They're all trademarked, but say a fundamental version of PHP is out there, and it can be adapted and enhanced also. And you can also upgrade or pay for a professional or enterprise if you want. But it's no cost, RPMs, and they really work well. We're happy, very happy so far. So why RPM your PHP? It's a really quick installation process. It's not a giant save file to download and unzip. I mean, with all due respect, that save file was meant to include a lot of tools that the original PHP users on the I may have wanted, green screen menus and extra administrative pieces that may have made it easier to get started at first, but now the RPMs are a lot quicker. It really just takes minutes, and it's mostly automatic to get the software. The yum command, which maybe you've heard of, it's industry standard again. Yum is the command that pulls down the software, it installs it. It asks you, do you want to install this? Yes. It installs it in a standard location. So IBM has chosen QOpenSys as the location for all of these tools, not just PHP, but all of them. So I like the fact that there's the standardization now, that if you want to find where your open source software is located, you can look in QOpenSys and find it in most cases. So the other thing is, like I say, the cool kids like it, not necessarily only kids, kids of all ages. People who are interested in what's new on the eye are interested in open source. It looks like a normal place where open source can go. So I think that, say, new talent coming to the eye, it's always a concern of mine, making sure that the eye is friendly and welcoming to new talent. And new talent are people who are probably used to the Linux environment. And so they will welcome anything that reminds them of kind of Linux or standard open source environments. So that's something else that I like here. The upgrades are quick too. It's just use yum update, and it finds out what software needs to be updated and does so. So it's pretty painless. It's very good. You can also even automate or script if you've got a larger shop, multiple servers. First of all, you're not worried about, do we have a license? We've got to install our license on all these different servers. That's not an issue. So you save some time there. Also, which I'm not putting down commercial software at all. Definitely go for it. But obviously, there's just less work if you don't have that. So I'm not for or against. Anyway, yes.
Somebody asked, is this available on the 7.1.7.2, or do you have to be on a certain version of the OS?
7.2.
7.2? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, 7.2. You're welcome. Yeah, 7.2. Richard, if I'm wrong, correct me, but it's back to all like this open source environment. Yeah, it's 7.2. Yeah, actually, I know that. I know that because actually, when you go into Yum, you see that 7.2 in there itself. Okay. Okay, so you can also automate and script your installations as well with these commands. You can write shell scripts, bash scripts, or Python, or whatever scripts you want, and automate this. So that's another nice aspect here. Flexible, you can choose Apache, which has been our standard, or Nginx, which is a more open type of web server. They're both great. Your Apache and FastCGI config still work. You just need a minor change to the FastCGI configuration. I suggest, which I'll mention later too, I like being able to have multiple web server instances for different workloads. With Zend Server, it was possible to do, but it wasn't supported, so people were kind of leery of it. But I think it's a nice idea to have, or actually smart idea to have separate web server instances, like say, one for your really quick web page loads that should be a short timeout, have a short timeout, and then if you're creating PDFs or contacting external web services and you can't tell how long it'll take, have a longer timeout on those, and they won't conflict with your quick responses. So just there's a lot of flexibility you can do to have a kind of professional type installation. You can test in parallel with any Zend Server instances you may have. It's all in separate directories, libraries, and so on. If you want multiple versions of PHP through RPM, you can do the chroot technique, which IBM provides, which is like totally separate areas to experiment in. That's really flexible. You can do what you want. Something else I like about these RPMs is that they're 64-bit. At the moment, Zend Server is still 32-bit. Maybe it'll change in the future, but I'm just saying right now. And 64-bit is nice because it means you don't have to do tricks to get more, to do like memory tricks, like this loader control memory hack we used to do. This was even an article of mine about running PHP Composer. You'd have to increase the amount of memory you had, and people would call me saying, I got my job issued this dump. What's going on? Often it was because even though paste can support 62-bit, if PHP is 32-bit, you couldn't make full use of all that memory without have special configuration in the fast CGI or somewhere else. But now you can. So it's just one less thing to think about and worry about now that it's 64-bit.
Alan, where do they go to download? We had a question.
There'll be a link later on. There'll be a link later on in the site. It's like a Zen repo site. Okay. So there'll be a link later on. Yeah, great question. Yeah, it's not part of the IBM repository, so it's in a special one, but you'll see the link later.
Okay.
But yeah, keep the questions coming to make sure we don't miss anything.
Okay.
Just give me the link, everyone says. Stop talking about what it does. Okay, so the performance is good. PHP 7 was already fast. If you aren't on PHP 7, I suggest going to it. It's faster. You'll see your websites just kind of pop. But PHP 7 with RPMs is even faster. And I don't know all the reasons why yet, but I did a silly CPU type benchmark, just a loop. And you'll see that later. It just was a lot faster. So I don't know why. I'm not saying it'll definitely be really, really faster with realistic applications. I need to do more tests, but so far it's very promising. But definitely it's quicker to start up. If you're calling it from CL or something, there's just fewer pieces to load. So it's just quicker as far as I can tell. Again, you can verify this yourself, but this is in my experience so far. The PHP is open and flexible. So this initial community PHP is missing some of the extensions that used to be bundled or still are bundled in Zend Server. But we can rebuild them, like we're doing this and other people could too, like IBM DB2. IBM is moving toward ODBC. So the old original IBM DB2 extension wasn't considered critical. So, but we'll talk about that later. Migrating to ODBC, or we can rebuild this. LDAP, English Image Magic, the mail function has to be implemented like with send mail, which we're doing that, it's fine, but you have other options, you have PHP mailer and so on. But the cool thing is IBM's done a great job in building infrastructure to let us build new things and include them in the RPMs. So are you on PHP 7 yet? If you're not, look into it. It was spurred by this competition with Facebook, one of the major users of PHP. They came up with their own variation on PHP, callback. And so this was just a chart from a while back when Zend decided to just make sure their own, that standard PHP was just as fast, just as good as that one. And it really is faster. There's also some other new features. There's that make applications more reliable, like type declarations. So you know what types, it's not just strings anymore, you know what types of data you're passing into functions and what types you're getting out of functions. And some things along those lines that just improve the quality. You can kind of verify the quality of your applications better. If you haven't moved to PHP 7 yet, which is true on Zend Server as well as the RPMs, there may be some code changes required if you're using old techniques, like if you're using MySQL and you're still using the old MySQL _ functions, you need to update them to MySQL which you probably should do anyway. MySQL improved, and some old regular expression syntax was removed. The main thing we see is the MySQL ones. If you've got old code, you'll need to update that. But really, there's not that much that has changed. Just it should work. I have a blog post about some of the changes, which is the link is here in the slides. You'll all get the slides later. Which the only difference is that if you're using RPMs, the path to PHP is different. It's under the QOpenSys directory. So if you see any articles about PHP on the IBM, they mostly will still work. Just need to change the path if there's ever a path provided to the one you're seeing here. Check your logs to look for any messages, and you can even some tools online so you can test your code for compatibility with PHP 7. For the most part, it'll work. Just check your logs because PHP is really good. It tells you, warning, this function may not work in the future version. If you see that, that's a reason to think of updating it. And best of all, PHP 7 can run in parallel with older versions like PHP 5.6, whether it's even Zend Server. It runs in parallel, even within Zend Server. So there's no reason not to try it. And it's just a little joke. If you find PHP 6, let us know. It's a geek joke. There was no PHP 6. They skipped over it for reasons left best unsaid. No, it's okay. So here was just a simple speed test that I did. I like it. It shows, for those of you who do debugging, it's nice. I use a function called MicroTime that returns the current time in seconds. And I just did a loop. And again, this is not a really practical application. It's just an example of something you can do. And I ran it, just to compare. So PHP 5.6, this took 0.37 seconds, this loop. A little trick here, you notice I say PHP-N, there's a -N. This is running from a command line like SSH shell or QP2 term. The -N means that PHP does not look at an INI file at all. It doesn't load any extensions, just remove some of that from the speed. So anyway, 0.37 seconds. PHP 7 took only 0.30 seconds, and then this other one, RPMs, was so much faster, I didn't want to put it on the slide because I didn't want you to get the wrong impression that I'm saying it's always faster, but in my test it was. So as far as installing it, and Richard will do some demos too, but there is a link I like. People ask me what's a guide that you really like. There's one that our friend King Harrison did, and we have no affiliation with his company or anything, but he documented his own steps, this ODBC PHP.K3s. I like it. It's pretty good. It shows installing PHP and ODBC also, as well as even some instructions here. So just to follow some of that along, if you're not using SSH yet, I suggest you go to it. I know Richard will back me up on this too. SSH secure shell is a really good way to get into a Unix type of shell. Yes, there's Q shell and there's QP2 term, which run right on your eye, but this SSH is more industry standard, and more code and shells and programs will work this way. You won't run into problems because it fully supports everything else that terminals normally would support. I also suggest use the bash shell. Bash is a shell that runs on SSH. Your younger developers will thank you. They can do so much with this. Best of all, you have like an F9 equivalent to get back your previous commands. So I really recommend you use SSH. And here's the command: start TCP server SSHD. If it's not running, runs on port 22. I suggest you do that. So following the instructions from those K3S guide, but I will cover some of it here with commentary by me and Richard possibly. So first, you need to get the open source package management working on your system. This is all provided through Access Client Solutions. I'll just silent show of hands. How many of you are using Access Client Solutions, ACS? It replaced the old client access and even the web-based tools. So it gives you a lot. You have your SQL window, run SQL, and it also gives you an open source tool. And so there's a link there from IBM how to do it. And once you get that set up, then you can add the community PHP repository from the IBM's Yum environment. This is again from SSH, for example. And this works with any repository. We have our own that we add too, and you can have your own that you add. This is one that Zend is hosting that has the community, like the base level community PHP from repos.zend.com. So somebody asked how to get it. So you do Yum config manager, add repo, and thereafter everything becomes automatic. This repository gets added to your IBMI, and when you do an update or an install, your installer from Yum knows where to go. It looks in all the repositories you have set up. The IBM one will be there by default. Now you add this Zend one, you could add others in the future as well. So that works very well, Yum config manager. This is showing how to get to the open source package management tool through Access Client Solutions and get the latest version because of the Access Client Solutions, because they keep improving it. If you had any negative experiences, get the latest version. It's just getting a lot better and better and better. So you click on this tools, open source package management. You log in with a user and password. You need to have need to have an all object user to install things with Yum or this tool. Not to run the code or use it, but just to install. You need to have this level all object. You'll receive some prompts. Yes, yes, yes. Install the open source environment from ACS. And then you have a list. You see, here you have a list of your installed packages, updates, and available packages. So I think it's really cool what they have done for us, what IBM has done. So it's continuing about installing PHP. Again, these are in the documentation, but you can use the Yum command, Yum install PHP -*, and that installs all the PHP stuff, if you will, from your repositories. Not just PHP itself, the language, but also the extensions that are included. Okay, installs PHP and the extensions with that wildcard. There's also from that setup document and setting up Apache or Nginx. The nice thing is if you have Zend Server installed, your Apache instance will still work, or you can make a copy and play with it and make another version, but it still works. You'll want to set up ODBC as well for DP2, and there's even instructions on how to connect from Linux or Windows computer. and using the PHP toolkit or external service. Let's cover some of this here, not everything in detail, but some. Fast CGI. I just want to, in case people aren't really I people, I want to say fast CGI is not the same as CGI, regular CGI. People who are not from the IBM I world say, oh, CGI, that's so old, that's like 1990s. Why are you still using that? No, but fast CGI, first of all, RPG CGI is optimized, and fast CGI is different. Fast CGI pre-starts your PHP jobs in advance to handle web workloads on the fly. So it starts everything up so it's quick to respond. Pre-starts all these jobs. Like in the lower right-hand corner, you see a screenshot of this PGM PHP Fast CGI in a web server name. We call ours RPM server, but you can call it what you want. So these jobs are pre-started and they're quick. In the fastcgi.conf file, and you have one today. If you have Zend Server, you have one of these today. Say in www.zenphp7 conf directory, and it has a number of directives in there. The key components of it are server type should say PHP, command line, and this is the binary. This is the program that actually is PHP itself that runs when you someone connects through your website. Again, qopenSys packages, where all the packages go. bin, bind, PHP CGI. Okay, so that's the minimal contents, but we're going to show you some more that you may want to use. This is stuff like your mother never taught you, the Fast CGI. So one is the PHP Fast CGI children, which you see there on the screen, which the Zend default was 10, simply because it's been going on a long time and the older machines weren't as powerful, but maybe you want to make it 20 to start out with. And this is something you may want to do a load test on. Get some load testing software. There's a separate presentation I do on the performance and scalability, but you may want to test this, see how high you can go. 20 is a nice place to start. How long to wait? If you ever see in your Apache log a 4-way timeout, you may need to increase your timeouts. This is 60. The default was always 60. 60 is much too much for a web page, 60 seconds, but it might be fine for contacting an external web service. So what do you set that value to? What's the right amount before you get a timeout? That depends on your application. That's why I think you may want to have 2 separate web server instances or multiples depending on your application. I don't want to complicate it, but I think if you're really scaling, then you may want to have multiples. In any case, those are 2 settings you really should look at in the fastcgi.conf, or I suggest you should. We often look with clients at this and they didn't really know what it all meant. Here's more of a complete run here. So there's just other settings here that you may be able to look at. I just highlighted the key ones, the children and the request timeout. Okay. You can also leave it just very simple. You may just use this. It's a very perfectly fine one. Perfectly fine setting. Okay. And that all should be on one line incidentally, even though it's wrapping here. It should really be on one line. Other options you have is the Nginx web server. This is flexible. On the I, we're accustomed to Apache and like it. It's great. It's even improving all the time. It's getting better all the time, as they say. But Nginx is also available, and people who come from an open source world may prefer that one. It's more easily scripted, I think, scriptable and setupable like that. But it's just another option. And there's another fast CGI implementation in that case. PHP IDE settings, INI settings. You know, with Zend Server, they gave us kind of an administrative console or admin page where you change your settings of all your extensions and your timeouts, your time zone. You'd kind of do it through there and make sure the daemon was running and restart it. But now we're kind of a bit back to basics, where you edit the PHP INI files directly and all those other conf.de INI files directly. Using any editor you want, you just do it directly. I kind of like it because I know what's going on. I definitely changed it. Restart the web server, I'm fine. Here's something you should update, the time zone, date.timezone. Go in the php.ini file, update that. Otherwise, it'll be very confusing because your logs and things will show you like a Greenwich Mean Time or UTC. It'll be the wrong time zone. So go in there and change that, I suggest. Okay, again, ask questions if you have any. ODBC is back, and you're going to be in trouble, the song goes. So before, no, actually, it's an improvement because before, IBM was building custom middleware. There was not a driver for ODBC that ran on the IBM I in Pace. The driver did not exist. It ran in Windows and Linux, but not on the I. And so IBM used this SQL call level interface API, a set of APIs. And IBM created custom middleware. For instance, those db2 underscore functions. that you may be familiar with PHP. It's called the IBM DB2 extension. They developed that. It's open source, but IBM basically maintained it. There was one for Node, one for Python, all these different ones, and it really was very difficult to keep up. If you're connected to the IBMI from Linux or Windows or anywhere, and you use those functions, you needed a special product that was a paid product called DB2 Connect. That let you use the same code on Windows, Linux, Unix, Windows, and the IBMI, which a lot of developers wanted. Let's code on our PC and then run it on the I. You had to pay. It was pretty expensive too. It was thousands of dollars. So you either had to pay for that product, DB2 Connect product, or use ODBC from your PC and then change to the DB2 functions on your I. So now, open source to the rescue. There's a driver for ODBC called Unix ODBC. It already was on those other platforms, but not on the I. And so IBM had to do that work, port it to work for IBMI for DB2. Now it's there, and I think it's great. IBMI is more mainstream. You can connect to it, and you can run code on the I directly. So there's no more compromise. Before, it was always a compromise. I didn't know what to tell people. It was really hard. Now there's no more compromise. ODBCs that understand, frameworks that understand ODBC can use them too. What developers are enjoying is they can develop on their PCs and deploy the same code to the IBMI. They can use their debuggers and everything that they have in their IDEs. So that's really nice. People are appreciating that. Something about the ODBC architecture. Now, these connections work the same from other platforms and on the I. So I think simplicity is good. Simplicity is good. There's less to diagnose, fewer issues to diagnose. Whether you have your RPG applications and so on, or your PACE applications. PACE applications can now go to, you can go from other platforms or from the I. So from all your PACE applications. So I think that's a great change. And that means that IBM can continue to improve the quality as well. So there are some prerequisites. You do need yum, as you said before, wget that pulls software down. RPM works with yum. And then you need the Unix ODBC. Sorry, I have a typo in there, which we'll fix. Unix ODBC. And you can see what the cool thing is. You see this open source package management screen from ACS. It's showing you exactly what packages you need to download that are there. I mean, they're highlighted in this slide, but they're right there. And you click on them and click install, and they come down. Okay, so these are open source. IBM provides all these tools. First, you have to go to the IBM Access Client Solutions site and get the ODBC driver. You need a user ID. I'm sure most of you have done this somehow or other, gone to the IBM site, set up a user ID, and then download this. This is what the screen looks like. It's called the PACE. They don't call it ODBC exactly. They call it the PACE application package. PACE application package, and that includes the ODBC driver. And that's after you log in and go to the Access Client Solutions. So not too difficult. You unzip it. We give the file name here. We called it XX. We don't know what the version is that you'll get when you go. But you get that RPM and you transfer it to your IBMI, move it to your IBMI somehow. You can use ACS even to do that, to transfer that. So that's that zip file, and you unzip it. It's an RPM. And then you install that RPM. So it's no more save files, needed with creating the empty save file and the FTP and all that stuff. This is more industry standard. Just move it to your IBMI. To get into SSH, there's different terminals. I have a Mac. So Mac has a terminal built in. And what they call it? They called it terminal. That was very creative. On Windows, you have PuTTY and many others. So I suggest you use one of those, but you could use QShell or keep-it-your-term, any of those if you need to. So anyway, here are the commands you use to run. You go to the root and you set the path. You'll get very used to this path. This path, QOpenSys packages bind or bin, is the path for all this open source software. And then you export just sets it up so you can use it. And then you run the RPM command. That installs that RPM file that you downloaded from IBM ACS. It'll tell you what it's doing. It's saying I'm installing it, and then it finally will tell you it's installed. Again, now ODBC should be there. It's there now. And here are the commands. Because IBM installs an ODBC configuration file by default. You want to just check that it's there. So you do change directories to the etc, and you'll get used to these directories. The etc is where the ini configuration files usually are in a standard way. Cat command displays contents. So if you didn't know that, you'll get familiar with that cat command. It's a Unix command. And if all is well, you'll see the contents of the file, which is very standard, system localhost, user ID current by default, which means you don't have to log in to use ODBC if you're already logged in with a user profile. You could connect to a different IBM system as well. But by default, it's localhost, just means the current partition. If there's any questions, send them on in.
There was one, Alan. It might have been a couple steps back, but I didn't have a good chance to interrupt.
I was talking too fast. All right.
Well, no, I was going back and forth with the person trying to find out what the question really was. So Bruce, if you're not shy, if you want to jump in here, but he had a question about when he was downloading the RPMs via HTTP and installing them, he was having some errors. Is there maybe a good place to help troubleshoot if you run into errors?
I would say maybe you could email Richard and me at the end. We give our email addresses. I don't like there's other places to go. We actually have some links. There's a River site, R-I-V-E-R, River site. That's an open source, kind of IBM open source place. There's also a IBM OSS midrange.org mailing list. Those are two very mainstream places to go.
Okay.
So
and Alan, Alan, I would also add too, we need more than just that it doesn't work. If you can send a list of error messages or something that you're getting, because that helps, right? Picture's worth 1,000 words or 1,000,000 words for that matter.
I'm going to try and recreate the error and get more information. So, but I just thought if there was a place that we can direct people to that might help them too. So,
I think we have a link. We'll have a reference to those two places, or email us with some details. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, awesome.
Even Alan, even your forums would probably be a good place, I would think, too. Midrange list, your forums, River. I think there's a couple different sites that probably are relevant.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Cool. Yep.
I got to revive my forum, by the way. It's there. Maybe it's time to revive it. Exactly. Okay, Laura. Sorry.
And then we have one more question. Does IBM support the Mac version of the ODBC driver yet? There's a beta copy that's installed. But
exactly. I received an update of the beta just recently, a couple of weeks ago. So I don't believe, I'm not going to speak for IBM, but I don't believe the Mac version is installed. Richard, have you tried it?
Yeah, actually it works really well. And I think this is from John Paris. John, if you have the download link, the refresh should be there. He's probably on mute, but anyway, just try and download the latest.
So I think he's good.
Yeah, they just don't have an official release date, because I asked about that too when they sent it to me, and they said just play with it, but we don't have a date yet. But it's a godsend for the Mac side of the fence, because now you've got Windows, Linux, Mac, and IBM OI all running the same exact code base, which is cool for PHP.
Okay. So I think John's good. So then we have one more. Is it better? Well, they keep popping up. So is it better to install Apache or on another server? And is there any differences on how you choose what to do?
Or do they mean on a separate IBM partition or server? Is that what they mean? Rather than on the same partition with their databases? Maybe they could clarify that question.
Yeah, so let's see if he hasn't answered. So Alex,
I would say, if I can add my 2 cents as Richard, I think it's whatever platform you're comfortable with. If you got a Linux server and that's where you want to run it, I think the drivers perform really well, especially on today's gigabit networks. If you want to run stuff inside the IBM I, then you run it there. That's the beauty of this now. That same code base can be deployed just about on any of those platforms with the same exact ODBC connectivity.
That's true. Run on the I, run off the I, run your code on the I, and then reverse proxy in front of the I potentially as a potential security enhancement. I kind of like that approach, is have your application on the I, is have something in front of it, is also possible, or many of those commercial ones. All those Cloudflares, if you're really big, Cloudflares, or a small one, or a separate partition, your DMZ. So many ways to go. But anyway, if you get a clarification on the question, if we didn't answer it, you can interact with that one. I'm always interested in that.
Okay, yeah, if he comes back, we'll do that. And then there's just a clarification. I think you might have mentioned midrange.org. It's midrange.com in case.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
So, and then are we going to talk about security on certain things? Paul is asking about security, but it's not a detailed question. So.
Okay.
So we can probably,
I'm
yeah,
not
Paul, if you have
particularly, other than SSH, though.
Hey, Alan.
What's the same? Yeah. What do you? Yeah, Richard.
Well, I was thinking, think in context to Zen Server, because I think the question is, I'm reading it here. It says, how do I secure the INI files and the actual code? So, you know, think about what you probably might have even done on Zen Server. I imagine any security things would apply here as well, right? Like lock down the directories to only specific users that should be executing or viewing the code, you know, those sorts of things, I would think.
Oh yeah, and specifically what we would do is the PHP infrastructure. There's a web server user that needs access to it, like QTMH HTTP, for example. That user should have read access to most files. If you want to secure it, you should have read access to most files. It's star R. It needs RX for the directories in order to get down to the files below, because X means search for directories. And you need to write to log files. So it needs to log to any web server logs and the PHP log. That's basically what it is. So it only needs write access to log files pretty much, and R to the others, and X to directories. That's pretty, and of course RX to anything executable. So that's the basics on that you may want to do. And if you're running PHP from RPG or CL, then that's a different set of users, most likely, if you're running from an interactive job or batch job or something. So you have to just take care of the security, IFS security for those users. So that's the basics of what you would do. That's a great question. I know we just show how to install it and say something about it, but in reality, you may want to lock that down better. And that's how you do it. It's like the web server user is the main one. Make sure it's limited. So for instance, you don't want your web server user overwriting PHP itself or configurations or something. Most cases. Great. Okay. Any other questions? Just shoot them on over. Potential PTF. So if you want that current user, meaning this is just to go back a slide because we had some questions. Something nice about this ODBC is that you can run as current user, meaning say for testing purposes, or even in your application, if you want to just run as your existing user in your existing job, then do that. And you can do that with this current user, that's so-called star current. You may need a PTF if you're on 7.2 or 7.3 for that current user to work, meaning you don't need a password because you're already signed in to your user profile. 7.4 doesn't need it. So this is a standard approach that will come up over time. That's if you're connecting to your current system because you're obviously already logged in. Okay, hope that's clear on that one. So to make our first ODBC connection, hooray! And the nice thing is there's a tool for that, and this one's called ISQL. And it's an industry standard. It's open source, not just for the I. I love this when we can use tools that don't have to be just developed for the I and they're special and you can't find out about them. This ISQL is industry standard. I even put here, there's a link to a web page that tells you about it. That's not an IBM web page. So it's a lot easier to find information that way. It's not obscure. So to test it, again, from ideally a bash shell and SSH, type ISQL, press enter. It takes you into the tool, gives you some options here, command line options. You can run SQL. If you want some more information, you type star local -v. The star local brings you in to your local environment. Again, it's the one that was from here. You see the second line on this odbc.ini file is star local in the brackets. So that's how you get into star local. It's nothing magical. It's all just configuration. So we go into an SQL prompt right from within PACE here in this ISQL, and -v is for verbose logging, more logging. So this is nice. You can actually test SQL. Another place to test SQL using ODBC. From there, you can type a query like this default, this customer data table, which we all have on our systems. Select from that, and it shows you the data right there from within your terminal. I think that's pretty neat. So you make sure ODBC works, and it tells you how many rows it got. Okay, so that's a great test. I always do that when we install ODBC. Now your PHP and ODBC, it looks like normal PHP, but instead of DB2 connect, you have ODBC connect. And you can type in a user and password or leave the defaults if you've got that current option set up. Instead of DB2 exec, you have ODBC exec. And yes, for security, if you're passing parameters in, you'd have ODBC prepare and ODBC execute, just the way you would with the DB2 prefix. And then we use ODBC fetch array. Now this is different. If you're converting your code from DB2, IBM DB2, you can't just do a search and replace all the time. unless you're careful. In the DB2 functions, you'd have DB2 fetch assoc, ASSOC, associative array. If you did that array fetch in DB2, you'd get indexes. Your array would be keyed by indexes, but ODBC, it's keyed by the names, the column names, which is the way I always like it, having column names. So this is the equivalent of DB2 fetch associative. And it does some output, which just works. You can see on the right side, output an array, print R, outputs an array. So just, that's it. I mean, there's more functions. There's more functions than these, but this is the basics. And you can look them up as usual on the php.net site, or that's an easy way to do that. Again, any questions, go ahead and ask.
Alan?
Yep.
Yeah, Richard.
This is Richard. I'm going to be showing this in my demo, but could you maybe just give a little context to, like, so this version of using ODBC, but also the PDO, the PHP data objects as well, because I'm going to actually use, that's what I'm using primarily in my demo.
Yeah, there's two ways. Yeah, I'll say something, and Richard, you can add to this also. You're really jogging my memory a little, because what IBM has done a wonderful job with ODBC. There's in the configuration files, or when you connect, you can set various options, including the option to use library lists, which is naming mode, turning naming mode on. You can set library lists. There's a lot of other options. So I want to mention that. And second, there are two styles of ODBC connectivity. It was true of the IBM DB2 connector also, but it's even more true here. There's a procedural approach, like this ODBC Connect, where you use functions. And there's an object-oriented approach, which is PDO, PHP Database Object. And that's an alternate approach that I think is going to be more popular in the ODBC realm, which is using the PDO and objects. And you'll see that from Richard when he does his demo. So just so you're prepared, but it's almost the same, but it's not a function. It's more like objects and methods. But you make a string to connect with. So you'll see that. Is that what we were kind of getting at, Richard, to make sure people kind of understood?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for our purposes, it's going to look pretty much the same today, but I know there's frameworks out there that primarily use the PDO data objects too. So just knowing that there's two different ways to do it. I'll show them both when we demo, but they're going to look pretty close.
Right, exactly. Okay, thanks for mentioning that.
So there's two questions that kind of were backed a little bit. So there was one, you were talking about Apache and then an open source alternative to Apache.
Yes.
You didn't catch the name that you
it's called Nginx. It's spelled Nginx.
Okay.
Pronounced Nginx. Nginx.
Okay.
Apache itself is open source, but IBM has given us a kind of integrated version of it, whereas you're waiting for IBM to make updates to it, essentially. You get what IBM gives you, which is good, but it's whatever IBM gives you. Nginx is the open source, so you get probably quicker releases of it, but you're a little bit more in control, but also on your own more at the same time. But we like it. Nginx is good. Yep. Okay.
Awesome. And then there's one more, and this might be coming later, but if it is, we'll table it. But he asked about the PHP toolkit for IBM, how you get that installed and downloaded.
Oh yeah. PHP toolkit is open. So first of all, PHP toolkit for IBM is open source. It's completely open source. There are two pieces to it. One is XML service, which is the back end, and that's common for all the languages. IBM actually ships that in XML SRV. IBM includes that on your IBM I in a library called XML SRV. So if you check there, that's where XML service is. The toolkit, the PHP part of the toolkit, is available on GitHub. It's under the Zend. If I don't have a link to it, we'll paste that in. Okay.
Okay. Awesome. That
Richard, Richard, you could. It's Zend. There's a GitHub repository with the PHP toolkit in it that's totally open source. You can even install it through Composer, like when we're using Zend Framework, Laminos, or Laravel. We usually use Composer to install it, and that's all available too. Actually, you will want to download an updated version of the toolkit because it works better with ODBC. Hey, Richard.
Yeah, Alan, I'll find the link for it and paste it in the chat window for everybody. And then we're not covering it in any demos today, so that could be a future session perhaps if we wanted to just spend time on XML toolkit. But today was really around what's part of the open community PHP.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's good that someone asked it because it can be confusing because some distributions say we include the toolkit, but really it's open source, so anybody can get it. So if Richard, if for some reason you don't find a good link, we'll send it off later. But yeah, if you paste it, that would be great.
Okay, great. We're up. Great. That's all the questions so far. So thank you, Alan.
Okay, these are great questions. Give us some insight of what we'll talk about too in the future as well. So optimizing ODBC. So ODBC is becoming a bigger part of our world, thanks to IBM, what they've done, and also this addition of PHP. But the default configuration is really not that optimized. It's a pretty small number of jobs, the pre-start jobs. This is standard IBMI terminology here, pre-start jobs. They're named QZDA, SO init, same for JDBC. And they run the QSysWorks subsystem. So take a look at how your system is set up right now. Display subsystem description, just like here. Go through these steps and you'll see for the QZDA SO init, the defaults are very low. Initial jobs only 1, threshold 1, additional jobs 2. I mean, it'll increase as you go. If you need more jobs, they'll increase automatically, but it's just it'll take time to do that, to start them. And also they'll kind of peel back down to the lower number when the system gets quiet. So we'll show you in a second how to determine what the better values are for those. Here's the command. This is IBMI command. You can display pre-start job usage statistics. And I have to admit, I'm a little embarrassed. I never really looked at these until we got into all this ODBC, and I started looking into it. Talked to my friend Dawn May, and she kind of clued me in a little bit better too on what the best way to do this is. Here's 2 commands. One is for IBM DB2, which you'd also look at if you're using that. And then the second is for ODBC. And this is an example from my system or a customer system. Current number of pre-start jobs running, the average number, and the peak. This should give you an idea of how many jobs you may want to have running all the time. May not be the peak, but it may be at least current or average. And then the number of jobs in use was 27, meaning in use, meaning actually being acted on, like a job being used at the moment. And then look at the bottom, program start request, waiting, average number of waiting, peak number, average time to wait. So that's just like, was PHP or anything else waiting to get an ODBC job or a QSQ, SRVR job? Were we waiting at any point? If we're waiting, then you may want to increase the number of jobs. This is great information, great statistics here, including the number of accepted requests. That's cool too, to be able to see. If there's any questions about this, let us know. You may not have looked at this before, but it's part of understanding your IBMI. And whether you're running PHP on the I, off the I, or anywhere, this is something you want to look at. Actually, Richard, I just thought of this. If developers are developing for their computers, that's another reason to increase this number. It's going to be more requests coming in from developers potentially, and so forth. And if you're doing load tests, you can balance it. So anyway, I think this is very interesting. Now, choosing an IDE, getting closer to a demo, a lot of editors. So there's ones based on Eclipse, like Zen Studio is one that I believe you have to pay for now. It was free before. But there's also NetBeans as a free IDE. Visual Studio Code, I'm a recent devotee of that. If you install the SSH plugin, which also is free, then you can connect to your IFS. It's a nice IFS browser and edit configuration files and edit your PHP code. It's very good. Richard will show Visual Studio, I believe, later. PHP Storm is a paid product. My serious Seiden group developers love PHP Storm. They're pretty much unanimous. The ones who are doing a lot, but Richard loves Visual Studio, so there's different options there that you may like. I shouldn't have said that, Richard, because you're one of us too.
Remember, I'm the evil.net guy.
Yeah, exactly. You're a little bit suspect. Actually, it took me a long time. Now I'm using VS Code and enjoying it. So there you go. Some debugging techniques. Just a simple slide about this. We've in the past, I'm sure we've all used var dump and errorlog. Like errorlog writes messages to the PHP log, which is great because you can see it in line with other errors that PHP generated. But var dump is cool too. But you could do interactive debugging, and Xdebug is a famous way to do that. That's an open source extension. I don't think it's a community PHP, but we built it. You can get it from various sources, but it's just a standard one. It can take you through debugging, like stepping through line by line, remote debugging on the I, stack traces, and then the various IDEs. Richard may show something to you on this, that the IDEs you have their own debugging that you can use also. So I think at that point, let's do some code. And Richard, I'd like to switch this over to you. I'm going to stop showing my screen. So first, are there any other questions before we do a demo, have a demo from Richard?
No, I think we are all up to date.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Richard, if you're able to, take control. And I'll mute myself also for now.
Yep, hopefully you guys can see a screen. Yep. It should say, welcome to the PHP.
Yep, we see it.
Awesome, okay, cool. Well, I thought we'd maybe start today with just showing final products, because this will actually be a take-home example, and just like we did with our Python one I guess a couple weeks ago. I'll put this up on GitHub and you can clone it, and this is meant to be, whether you pull it into Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code or put it up on the I and the IFS, you should be able to just take this and run it almost immediately. So it's pretty cool. So I thought we'll start by showing it what it does, and it was interesting because I was on midrange.com today, and I noticed David Gibbs mentioned, I think we called it midrange.org. It is actually midrange.com, so I got that correction, and now it's on the record as well. But there was some discussion about, how do I do subfile type of applications, or what's a better type of subfile? So interestingly enough, our example application is a subfile, except we're doing it in PHP. Now, to be fair, I know there's commercial things out there like PHP Grid and things like that, but they don't really have free versions that work with ODBC. Like I know PHP Grid has a version that's free that works with MySQL. So if that's all you do, that's cool. But it's a paid version if you need to do ODBC. So I wanted to do something free. I tend to like to write my own stuff. So this is a good take-home example. And this particular one is really just a query, sort of an extension of what we did in our Python class. But and just my disclaimer is PHP is not my language, number one language. So you might criticize my style when you see my code, but it does work. So you feel free to call me out on that, especially after you get a chance to play with it. And if you see places I can clean up this application, that's perfect. You can contribute back to the community. But in this case, you can see we pulled in, and we'll look at the mechanicals behind this, but we pulled in a list of records, the usual QCUS application. You'll see it. If I want, I can do a search by number if I want to, and it does a filter on that. If I wanted to instead do a search on a name, very, very similar to what you would do in a subfile, right? I can search by a partial name if I want to, or a starts with, like in this case. And then I can drill in and view the detail. And typically, you might do that on an inquiry screen or a maintenance screen or something like that. So really just gave you the guts. The update and the delete and the new record functionality is not in this one, but at least you have the starting point for a pretty decent application. And this all uses Bootstrap. And for those of you, I won't go into HTML design, but Bootstrap seems to be sort of the number one way to do HTML visuals. And for guys like me who I love building logic and I love building code and back-end applications, but I hate working with visuals, it's nice because your HTML itself is actually really simple. All you have to do is work with simple HTML tags. So that's as much as I'll go into HTML design today. But so this is our final product. This one's actually up on our eye as well at the moment. We'll take a look at that. But we'll start with, so assuming I'm coming in from a developer standpoint, like Alan said, I'm actually using Microsoft Visual Studio as opposed to Visual Studio Code. We'll take a look at Visual Studio Code as well. But one of the nice things that I found is they have a plugin for just about everything, and like now Python ships with it. PHP does, but it doesn't ship all the functional tools that you necessarily need. So kind of like Alan was saying, PHP Storm is one of the IDEs of choice. I use Visual Studio, and then there was a little plugin that I bought called PHP Tools for Visual Studio. And what's nice is out of the box, it gives me what I'm used to with in any C# programming or Node or any of that. This environment you can all do debugging interactively, which to me is huge. Being able to run stuff, make it stop. In our case, connect up to the IBM I and take it and do our development from our desktop, and then just deploy it up in the I. So it doesn't have to be Visual Studio like I'm doing. I just happen to like this, but Alan mentioned several of the other alternative choices that you can use. Or maybe you don't use an IDE at all. You use Notepad or something like that. I know people that do simple editing that way as well. But so just typically if you're doing a new project, and I won't create one, but I'll just show you how stuff shows up in Visual Studio. So if you had installed this plugin that I use, all you have to do is they've got built-in PHP project types. So you just pick the one that you want to start with. I generally start with an empty project because I usually have some HTML pages or something that I want to start with. So you would start the project, and then it creates pretty much an empty structure. So like in this case, you'll see I've added some pages, but there was nothing here when I started. So pretty bare bones when you start out. But so going back to what Alan was talking about with tests, so typically you start with, in PHP, your settings are stored in some sort of file. It's a settings file, or in my case, I try and keep a lot of it in a database typically, but you'll see we've got various examples of ODBC connection strings that you can do. So this particular one, I happen to have the older client access on this PC, so I can use the old client access ODBC driver by specifying this connection string. If I happen to have the new IBM I access component on my Windows server, I might use this syntax, which is a little different, but IBM I also recognizes this syntax, because basically when IBM ported that driver, it was the IBM I access driver that they ported over. So connectivity syntax is almost the same. What most people will do if they're deploying natively is something like this. You have a connection string that just says *local, and you don't need to use the user and password. And then the user that actually, when you submit to run the PHP server, the Apache server, that user credential automatically gets picked up on the IBM I. So it's kind of a nice way to be able to do that. Or you can do a hybrid where you use *local on IBM I, and then use a connection string user and password. But for our purposes, we have our connection string for the system, a user and password that we're using, and then so you start with that. And so this is kind of an example like what Alan was showing, where so for PHP syntax, typically you have the beginning PHP tag, and then there's an ending one. Although I understand in version, Alan, maybe you can correct me, but there's a version 5 or version 7 where you don't need those trailing PHP end quotes anymore, if I recall correctly.
For a long time. It's been a long time that you haven't needed them. In fact, it's recommended you don't include them because it can cause problems with headers. So be the ending.
Yeah, there you go. So so Richard's first coding profile, right? He included the footers, but it will still continue to work either way, I believe.
Correct.
There are places you'll see in my pages where I use them because I've actually got some sections in my PHP, and I think in that case it is still mandatory, but we'll look at that when we look at a real page. But basically in this case, like Alan was showing, we're going to do a connect, we're going to read our connection string in, and we're going to just echo an error if something happens that it didn't like it. And then we're just simply going to run a query against our qcustDT table. And then I can just do a little loop and echo the data. So when you install this on your Windows workstation or your Mac or your IBM I, you'll be able to run this page. One of the nice things that Visual Studio lets me do is I can just right-click on the page and tell it that I want to run this page when I run this project. And then I can just hit play. And it launches automatically a web server instance for me, so it'll just run this application. And you'll see that this guy actually connected and it spit out some data. So basically it works the way it was supposed to. Let's break it just for fun, just to see. So let's just put in a bad password for this guy. And you'll see I have debug turned on my PHP environment, but it'll show you basically that some errors occurred, and you can actually go troubleshoot it. But even better, what I can do is, let's just say I wasn't sure what was going on and I wanted to step through the code a little bit. I can actually just open up this PHP file and F9, or I can click over here and mark it with a breakpoint. And now I can just run this project again, and it should stop before it tries to do my connection. And then I can take a look, like if I wanted to view this variable, and I might notice it here, or I might just want to step. So we'll go ahead and step through this. We'll say F10 to continue. All right. Oh, I got an error. So I noticed while I was doing my debug that I have an issue, and then I can determine what that is. And you'll see again that surfaces in the browser because it causes some errors when it goes through the rest of this code. And then you see this. So this is nice because it also makes it visible in your browser. In a production environment, I think when you turn off debug, Alan, these don't show up, right, in a production environment?
Yeah, correct. They don't.
Yeah, but when you're in dev mode, it's great. And you'll see the IBM I surface is the exact same way if you have debug turned on, which I do on my IBM I instance. So it's a great way to sort of test code out. So you'll probably want to use that guy first. And then this PDO test we were talking about, there's a thing called PHP data objects. You're going to see it looks almost exactly the same. The only difference is that I'm using this object called PDO. So this is the syntax you do. As I say, it's an ODBC connection. And then that same connection string we're going to use in this one. And then it does a connection, and then it spits out a little data. So it's got a little loop in this particular one that spits out some data. It looks a little different than the sample that I had because I grabbed this one off the web, but the same token, I can just debug this guy. So we'll step through it. And it's probably going to fail again, just like the other one, because I didn't fix my password, right? So, yep. So we'll go fix that. But it works the same way. Like if you were working out of the IFS, like we'll show in Visual Studio Code, I could just make this change and save this file directly back to the IFS. Or if I was using PHP Storm or NetBeans, I mean, they're all sort of a variation on a theme these days. So now in this case, it should connect. Yep, we're good there. And then we'll just let it play through by hitting F5. And you can see we got our data now. Oh, and actually it did run the wrong one. That was our ODBC test one we were running. So let's go over here and right click and tell it we want to run PDO test. And then we'll run it again. There you go. Now you'll see we've got our PDO component connected. And then this particular one just lists out all the fields and some of the information about each of the fields as well. But it's a good first step just to make sure you've got connectivity, because if this isn't working, none of your other stuff that's going to connect up to the database will work. And you're going to see in my subfile pages, they're really just variations of what I did in these test pages, just have a lot more HTML wrapped around them. So just in terms of structure, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the HTML, but so one of the things I did is I use, so at the top of every page, and this is where we were talking about opening and closing PHP. I think, Alan, if I'm correct, you have to use it when you mix it within a page, correct? Like in this case, I've got an include.
That's correct. Absolutely, you do.
Yep. Yeah, and I don't know, there may be is there a better way to template nowadays, or is it still typically how you design pages where you're mixing PHP tags and HTML? It's been a while since I've done any templating stuff around.
We mix, but we minimize it though. So we'll usually have code library for the heavier logic. And there's also templating languages as well.
Yep, yeah, so you probably wouldn't necessarily do it the way I do. The cool thing is that you can take this and adapt it and do some pretty nice applications as well. But you'll notice there's PHP here, there's a little bit of PHP here where it's including some HTML. We're doing some echoing in this page of some information. We've got a footer. So your pages could get really convoluted. And I think in the early days of PHP, that was the way people used to do their pages. But like Alan said, there's frameworks and there's easier ways to do templating. I wanted this to be sort of a raw PHP example that you could start playing around with, you know, again, with my disclaimer of you probably want to tighten that up and not necessarily program it the way I did. So essentially in this case, what this guy does is it says include those settings. So this is where my connection string comes in. So it always pulls that in from the same place. So we don't have any duplication. And you can do the same thing with just about anything where you want to include functionality. Like if you had let's say a bunch of ODBC functions or some business classes that were reading and doing some business logic, you would typically include them like that. And then I included that top nav bar you saw, it gets included. It's just a little snippet of HTML. So in this case, I'm just pulling this guy in. That's basically my top bar menu. And so it just pulls it in line as it's rendering that page. And then it puts out this HTML chunk, which was that top black nav bar that you saw. And then, so when that gets done, then we're just rendering our welcome. And I rendered a couple of blank lines. Normally you might have some other information there. And then I included our copyright footer. You might have saw that footer that said MobiGoGo and said Seiden Group on it as well. And then that's basically your whole page for the index page. So pretty straightforward. But when you click on the customer list, which is really where the meat is that you're going to use when you play around with this component, is you're going to see there's a page called queued_cdp list.php. And so what this page does, sort of the way it works, and you may when you start playing with the code, you might want to go back and listen to this if you haven't done PHP before. But the idea here is it includes our ODBC connectivity information. What this does is it checks to see if there was a post, which basically means we click the button from that top search area, like our subfile control area, if you think of it like that. And so it checks to see if we got a custom number or a last name. And so this is set actually checks to make sure that has a value in it, so you don't throw any errors. So basically, if something was set, it grabs the customer number, and if something was set for the name, oh, you know, actually, anybody see the typo? I just see a typo in there, but that should actually be last name. We'll fix that while we're over here. Here we go. But so essentially the idea is that you get customer number and last name as you're coming into the page. So those are the parameters that were entered. And then we've got our page HTML header. This is where all the bootstrap stuff comes from. Normally, you might include it in like a directory on your web server. In this case, it's actually linking out to what's called a CDN, which is basically an online site where these guys are hosted. So you don't necessarily have to install them. It makes it a lot easier to do development, because you'll notice I don't have any JavaScript or any extras in here. It's all coming from these included JavaScript libraries that it pulls in over the web. I think typically if you're doing your own private application, you don't necessarily want to do that, but it's a nice way to do a quick jump start when you're testing stuff. And then you'll see in this case, all this is doing is some simple, outputting a simple form. So it says basically when you click a button, we're going to call the same page again to post to it. We're inputting a customer number and a last name. And then we've got a button for new record, which isn't implemented yet, but then our search button. So real straightforward. And then you'll see this is our subfile grid. So kind of like your subfile control header is we've got column headers. And then now we enter a section of PHP where it does a little bit of logic to determine our SQL. So this says if there was a customer number passed, we're going to create a where statement. If there was a last name passed, we're going to create a where statement. If there's nothing passed, basically we're going to have an empty where criteria. So we might include all the records, or maybe only 1 or 2 pages of records if we want to. Or like if we were using something like PHP grid, I think it just binds that data and then the grid itself handles it, which is cool. But then it runs the query down here. You'll notice I'm pretty copious on my documentation. I tend to document every line, even if it looks obvious. I like to make it extra obvious by having descriptive commentary, because not everybody always thinks about these things when they look at code the same way. So I always like to have English descriptions in there as well. And then this is just a little loop that outputs, basically that's a HTML table row, and it outputs for every row. And that's where you see our grid actually being built out. If you think about it in an RPG program, this would be a loop like where you're doing a subfile fill or something like that. So logic-wise, it feels very similar. And then that's the end of the page. So not a whole lot to these pages. You'll see here, it's building a link. This is where we get to our detail page that when they click on that customer number, it's basically saying when you click that, we're going to call the detail page, we're going to pass it the actual customer number field. And one of the things to note here, let's see, I don't know if I have it in this comment. Let's see if I put it in there. Oh, yep. So when you're working with, I don't know if it's this way for every database, but I know with IBM I and DB2 and ODBC, typically you want to specify your field names in uppercase. I know a lot of times I see people use lowercase with SQL Server and other databases, but just make sure with IBM I that you use uppercase names when you're trying to pull back fields. So like in this case, these are all uppercase. If I did this in lowercase, I'd get an error. It would say something like field not found, and it would blow up on an error. So it's something to keep in mind when you're working with database fields. All right, so then on the detail page, you'll see it looks somewhat the same in that the only difference here is we're not doing a post when we click on a link, we're actually doing a get this time around. So you'll see the syntax changed a little bit. We're just saying we want to get the customer number parameter that came in with the get, because we knew it was a page get instead of a post. And then in this case, it's rendering the page. It's got our nav bar that it's outputting again. And then it's doing our logic for our customer query. You'll notice this time we're only checking the customer number though, and we're making sure that it got passed. So in other words, if it's not blank, we're going to go ahead and do the query. If it is blank, we're going to throw an error, and then we're going to exit this page so that this would show up in our page as an error. So this would be the concept of, let's say somebody was trying to hack and call this page and not pass any parameters to it or something like that. It would tell them that there was no parameter pass. So you want to always try whenever possible to handle errors as gracefully as possible. And I believe in PHP, I haven't done a lot of try-catch in PHP, but I think they have try-catch in PHP, don't they also, Alan, like they do in Python and all the other languages?
Exactly.
Yeah. So a lot of times I wrap all my logic, like an RPG, it would be a monitor and monitor, or in a CL program, it might be a mon message, but I tend to do that in my code as well, because I like to throw errors that I expect. And so by wrapping this logic, it was a try-catch, I could very easily say, go ahead and try all this. If something really blows, basically send something like a nice error that says an error might have occurred, or, please contact the administrator or something. And, maybe you log some information in a log file on your server or whatever. But yeah, I would take a look at using try-catch as well. And if I get a chance, I'll put some of this before I post it up on GitHub. I might tweak some of this a little bit as well. Again, knowing this is probably not the templating style you would want to use in a real production application. And you'll see here we're using that PDO connection again. We're using our connection string, running our query. And then in this case, I still do a for each, because In this case, I'm only expecting one record back because I did a query based on my customer number. So I didn't necessarily need to do that, but I did another for each because I'll only get one record. And all this guy is doing now is outputting each of those data fields. So this is my custom, my last name. And then this is all, when you use Echo, it's treating this HTML block as a whole string. But then what you'll see is it's actually jumping out of that. So a dot character is a concatenation character in PHP, but it's in the value, it's actually placing the database fields values inside those fields. That's why that's what makes them visible as part of this. And I'm sure there's a better way to template that, but I know like Python actually has these field tags and they just get picked up without having to concatenate stuff together. And I'm sure PHP with some of the template languages work pretty much the same way. But all this one's doing is outputting all that detail. So there's like 11 fields. And then if we happen to have an error in connection, it would give us that nice error. And then we've got a couple of buttons in there as well, like you saw. So really pretty straightforward and simple to be able to do that. And then the footer, this would be the bottom of your page if you had a master page. I just happen to put a couple of copyright statements in there. And then one of the things that I found useful is anytime I'm setting up a new PHP environment. So for example, in this environment on my desktop PC, I had an issue where the PDO objects weren't working correctly for ODBC. So this PHP info command, if you put that in a page called PHP info, you probably wouldn't want to leave that in place for production, but it allows you to debug. So I'll just show you what I was debugging in my case. So we'll just run this, let it go through.
We have a
and then we're going to switch
if you want.
Oh yes. Yeah, absolutely.
They asked, we assume you can do a prepared statement with the ODBC, just like you do with the DB2 commands?
I'll say a guarded yes. I haven't done one yet, but I believe it's part of the ODBC connectivity and part of the PDO object stuff.
Yeah, there's PDO.
So, yeah, we can.
PDO prepare and ODBC prepare. They exist exactly the same, almost exactly the same. It's what you're used to. Yes, you should.
Yeah,
great question, Chris.
And the same. And Alan, I think the same thing holds with stored procedures, right? They can call stored procedures, like so if they've got existing RPG stored procedures and that sort of stuff, they can do that even without the toolkit.
Absolutely, you can. Stored procedures are still supported just the same. Mm-hmm.
Yep. In fact, I think one of the things the XML toolkit component, and Alan may or may not agree with me because we haven't discussed this a whole lot, but in today's world, I think ideally you want to try and stay as mainstream as possible. And, to me, the XML toolkit stuff feels a bit IBMI specific. And, to me, I like the concept of using, even with .NET when I do it, is using the ODBC stuff as much as possible. And the same thing with calling stored procedures, because then I'm not stepping out to these, at the beginning we were talking about they used to have to create custom connectors and this and that, is you can get away from using some of those custom connectors and that sort of stuff. And you're just relying on the native database drivers, which I think is really powerful. And again, this same code runs on any platform, because I've tested variations of this and variations of Python with the ODBC driver, and I've tested them on my Mac. I've tested them on one of my Amazon Linux instances, talking to them on my IBMIs. I've tested them out of Pace, which starts to feel like a Linux server now. And I've also tested them from Windows and native on I. So what's cool is you can become very ambidextrous in the code that you write, and you really honestly don't care where it runs. Very, very close to how Java works, because Java is probably one of the only other things that comes close to that. And Python's getting there, and Node is there as well. But hope that makes sense. Any other questions before I go on?
Yes, I was on mute while I was talking. So.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah,
do we have a hard?
And if it gets too detailed, we can always, send information afterwards. But it says, do you write subfile code in PHP HTML, or do you write it in the DDS? And how does the code end up from RPG into the PHP?
Well, in my examples, I'm just using analogies. So basically, I'm trying to give people analogies to, if you were writing a subfile, here's the equivalent code in PHP. So I guess to answer the question, and this may be, you tell me if it answers it, but I'm not writing RPG at all in my code. This is actually RPG-like, but it's actually using PHP instead. And I'm sure John Paris and Alan will kind of agree to that. It's like you try and build analogies so people learn this stuff, in context to what they're used to doing. And when you're working with IBMI folks, I just try and draw analogies. If you're using a stored procedure call to an RPG application, typically it's going to return parameter data that can be used in your PHP application, or the same thing if you call a stored procedure that calls RPG that returns records, you're going to use the record data, but you're not really using any of the RPG directly in the PHP app, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you, he says.
Cool. I just quick question. Do we have a hard stop at 4, or can we go a little bit over? Because I got a few more things I'd like to show if we have time.
Yeah, I mean, as long as people stay on, the GoToMeeting can stay on, so that's good.
Okay, yeah, I mean, figure about quarter after.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure we finish up the Windows stuff and then show a couple of the native components and how to deploy it. And I'll show an Apache setup example too.
Okay.
Cool. All right, so, we were on PHP info, I believe. So this is how I ran into a problem. I was like, oh, why is this not working? And you can do this on your eye as well. Although I think, Alan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the PDO stuff for ODBC is enabled by default in PHP, or do you have to turn that on? I forget. The PDO ODBC.
I believe it's on by default. It's just the ini file. It's a PDO ODBC INI file. You uncommented if it's not commented. I mean, if it's commented out. But I believe it's on by default.
Gotcha. Yeah, so you can see here that it shows I have PDO ODBC enabled. This was not showing up in my configuration, so I was like, oh, what is going on my Windows server? And one of the nice things is this plugin thing that I use actually, you can actually have it automatically install various versions of PHP. So what I did is I said, well, let's go take a look at our PHP ini file, in our case on Windows. And where was that shortcut? There it is. And I think it's PDO_ODBC. We'll see. Here's that one. So the one I was looking for is this extension list, and this is where Alan said I think it's enabled by default on IBM when you do it. But this line did not exist in my installation. So so this one did. So that first ODBC component we used worked fine. But because you also want to enable this PHP data objects, I added this entry. So it's on the record in case you run into problems with you try that PDO test and it doesn't work. Just make sure whatever ODBC version that you're using has the PDO ODBC extension enabled. All right, so going to the I, let's say we got this working fine, we're ready to move it up to our IBM I. So in this case, we're all probably used to FileZilla or something similar. So basically, all you have to do is go highlight your files, and let's say you don't want to develop anymore on Windows or Linux or Mac. You can upload it to the IFS, and from then on, just maintain it from there if you want to as well. Or you can, push changes. It depends on what your deployment process looks like for applications. But in our case, we're going to go ahead and take all our pages, and we're going to upload them into our IFS. So this happens to be my PHP 01 server on my box. And so all those files now have been pushed up to my IBM I. And so there's an example of using FileZilla to push those. So now over on my I, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here, but you'll see there's a component for Visual Studio Code, which is what this is. This is an open source editor that runs on Mac and Linux and Windows. There's a component called SSHFS that you install that allows you to connect via SSH to your IBM I IFS. And as you can see, that's my PHP directory under my web applications, my htdocs. And then we'll take a quick look at our settings file to make sure everything is the way we want it. And so you'll see that's the same settings file that we were using on the PC, except with one difference. You'll see we commented out our Windows connectivity, and I commented in my DSN equals local. Now you heard me talk about this version I can use. The box that I'm on doesn't have the PTF that lets me use star local without a user and password, which is why I have it this way. But normally you'd do something like this, and then it would use whoever submitted the jobs to run, or that started the HTTP server, or actually it's the Apache user, isn't it? Whatever set up as default user, Alan, would pick up the ownership of those jobs.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But actually, yeah, it would go into the ODBC, unless if you're using local, then it stays with your web job or whatever it is. If you're using user and password, it goes into the separate jobs, ODBC jobs.
Yeah, and you do have the capability, if you want to store the user and password. I'll show you an ODBC configuration file in a minute too, but you probably don't want those things. You want as little as possible sitting out in open strings where if somebody were hacking in a directory, they could get a hold of it, right? You know, something we didn't secure it like we were talking about before, and people started poking around, they could potentially browse in here and see what my system name is or my user and password. Don't try and access that system because it won't take you anywhere real, because that's how I mask my system name, so you don't know where my system's at. But you know, so security by obscurity. So that's why I also tend to try and put, you know, typically I'll connect to the database, but I usually have a settings file where I keep all my application configuration settings too, so they're not sitting in the IFS, they're sitting in a DB2 table, and maybe they're encrypted, because a lot of times I like to encrypt settings too. So even if somebody poked around in a database with DBU or Start SQL or ACS or whatever.
Everybody, including us, does demos where the credentials are right there just because it fits on one screen, but that's not the real good way to do it in practice.
So just because I found this interesting, so today I happened to be working with somebody. I was online looking at something on their machine, and I got a message from QSec Offer that said, "Hey, this is so and so. Give me a call. Here's my phone number." So think of those spam emails you get. I immediately got on the phone. I said, "Who's sending me who's sending me messages on QSec Offer to call them?" But talk about a hacker moment, right? You're like, what is going on? Somebody's actually sent me a message through QSec Offer to a green screen that said, "Give me a buzz." And fortunately, I knew who the person was, but it's like I said, you probably shouldn't do that, because it makes somebody feel like there's a hacker on your machine. So anyways, I just thought that was kind of a funny incident since we were talking about security, but definitely one of those things you want to be careful of and have a few things unobscured. In fact, I probably most likely, even if I was storing my passwords like this, normally I'd have these guys encrypted too. So at least they'd have to take some extra steps and know where you hide your encryption key for anything that's in the settings file if you need to find it. But the point here is that we're back to Visual Studio Code, is I can make that change in Visual Studio Code, and then I can just save it right in here. And same thing with my PHP file. Actually, we don't want to save this change, but let's just go in just for fun to our index file. So remember we had, I think, our home page. Let's go back over to him for a second. So it says, you know, welcome to the PHP list example. And then we'll just say IBM edition. And then we'll save that. So you can do Control S, or I can go up and do File Save. But so that's saving. I'm actually doing my development right into the IFS. So what's cool is, right, I don't have to go compile. And I actually updated that PHP application, because these PHP scripts compile at runtime. When they run, they auto-compile. Okay. That's a good and a bad thing at the same time, right? Because it'll syntax check in your editor usually, but it doesn't necessarily logic check all of that.
We have another question, Richard. So it says, you said you put the connection variables in DB2. That's okay. But until you make a connection, how can you access such?
Oh, yeah, maybe I said it wrong, but I don't put all my connection strings in there. So going back to this, I put, you have to have at least a connection string. So this I would just typically try and encrypt, and you have to connect to the database. But ideally, natively, if you use this, you don't need anything other than this one item in here. That's what I was talking about, is I would encrypt and connect to the database with this. My settings, my actual application settings, like let's say I had my user IDs, my whatever page size for my paging or whatever, I put those in a DB2 table. So that would actually be in a database. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. But I try and have, so I connect, this is just my connection to the database. Anything else I need to deal with, I try and get out of a database table. It's like, I always think of Mapix and all these older ERPs that I used to work with. They all had a settings table for general settings. So I tend to do that with all my web applications that I build as well. But so we won't spend any more time on this, but Visual Studio Code, like Alan said, is a cool option. I know Alan's team is working on figuring out, I haven't used it to do debugging, but you can hook up to the Xdebug components as well with it. But we won't go any further today for that, but just know that that is an option for you as well. I still like the regular Visual Studio, but that's, again, my preference. The other thing that if you're on Windows, unfortunately, all of us, and I'm a Mac user as well, but if you're using Mac, this doesn't work. But I found out about this application a couple of years ago. this is pretty cool because this allows me to connect up. You'll see I'm connected to my IBM I not only have a shell session open, and Alan was talking about bash earlier, which is kind of the preferred way to do command line stuff. So, you know, normally, I'll get ready for a flash of green here. Actually, it's cyan, so we're actually not so bad. But, you know, in the olden days, we did this, right? Start, Q shell, ISQL, star local. So just to kind of prove to the point that, you know, I can run some of this stuff locally still if I want to in the green screen, but I won't. But the power of so I get, you know, kind of a character-based thing. The power of this environment, so I can do the same things here, is number one, this is just like F9, like Alan was talking about. I just hit my down arrow key. I can do that same exercise now over here. And you say, okay, whoop-de-doo, you can do that. The other beautiful thing is, and this is a throwback from the actually the DOS and the Windows, early Windows days, is there's this thing called Midnight Commander. It used to be called Norton Commander a long time ago. I got to get out of here first. There's a GUI that you can use as well. So not only can I do command line stuff, but you'll see I can browse and actually look at my files. I can search my IFS if I want to from here. So from a character-based screen through this shell, this SSH connectivity, I can actually edit or view files or move them around or search and that sort of stuff too. So this is, you know, you got Visual Studio Code, you have FileZilla, you have this guy, a Midnight Commander, which is, so if you've ever used Norton Commander in the past, it was modeled after that. I can also use SFTP is built in, so I can go here and actually edit directly out of here. Let's say I just wanted to edit one of these files. I can say open with default text editor. And so right out of the IFS, rather than using something like Putty Client or something like that, come on, open up. He's being cranky. Let's try that one more time. And even if, oh, interesting. Okay, so my connection might have gone stale on that one. Let's try. We'll try a different file. We'll do settings just for fun. But I guess the point here is make sure you, if you're on Windows, download a copy of this. You can even do telnet sessions with it and things like that. But also have a side-by-side console plus access to files for viewing and editing and that sort of stuff. We'll just say open this time. There we go. So I can actually make changes right here and then just hit save and it'll save it right back into the IFS for me. So this is almost like having an interactive GUI editor on your IBM I. It's about the closest thing I've seen. You know, and you got Visual Studio Code, PHP Storm, you know, all these other environments as well. That might make sense.
There was a question kind of along those lines. Is there any particular reason why you don't like Eclipse? We have someone that got used to using Eclipse and liked it, but was wondering if there were drawbacks, I guess.
Oh, I don't know if we didn't have Eclipse on our list, did we, Alan? I use Eclipse a lot. I use RDI. But I also use Eclipse for Java development. So yeah, that's another valid option if you like Eclipse, definitely. So we never tell you no, but yeah, I like Eclipse, and I use it a lot for when I'm doing RDI development and if I'm doing Java stuff. And I know there's even Python and PHP editors. In fact, isn't the Zen Studio, Alan, built on Eclipse?
Exactly. Zen Studio is based in Eclipse, and NetBeans, I believe, is. I mentioned those couple of options. Yeah.
Yep. So it's really what you're most comfortable with. It's, you know, it's the good and bad of having choice. You have choice, but then, you know, everybody debates what the choices that you make. And I always say whatever makes you most productive is what you should use. And in this case, as long as you can get to a shell command if you need to, or get in and out of the files that you need to edit, you know, you're covered, right? And so it's all about being productive with whatever tool that you pick. Sometimes you need the big hammer. Sometimes you need the sledgehammer. Sometimes you just need a little tap hammer. So I guess, you know, whatever you're comfortable with. Anybody else know any other editors that we didn't think about, though? But that was a good question. So I one.
I'd say Zen Studio, but I think you mentioned that. And then we have another question. I see many people who work with the front end technology using Mac versus Windows. Is there any reason for this?
If the question is why use Mac or Windows, I would add Linux to that list. They all, especially with Visual Studio Code and Eclipse and even NetBeans and the PHP Storm that Alan was talking about, every one of those platforms runs the same editor. So it's really personal preference. I have all of those platforms. So I'm one of these weird guys who works a little bit with everything. My primary is Windows. My second primary, so to speak, because it's always sitting next to me, is my Mac. And then I also do, my day job is filled with Linux because I do a lot of work on Linux VMs. So it's really personal preference. I don't think there's any pluses or minuses necessarily, unless Alan wants to speak to that one because he's a Mac guy.
No, really, I chose Mac so that it wouldn't do that automatic update when I was trying to leave for a train as a consultant. That's really why I picked Mac. That's all I have to say.
Yeah,
as a good terminal.
Yeah, and I just heard for any of you that are in the market for new Macs this year, they just released the what's old is new again. They went back to their old keyboard design, and so the MacBook 16 inches and the new 13 inches that just came out have what they call the Magic Keyboard, which is basically the keyboard that was out before, I think, 2015, before they had all the keyboard problems with the Macs. So if you're in the market, I would say now is a good time to buy a new Mac. I just found out as well, this is sort of an aside, and then we have one little thing to look at again if there's no more questions, is that the iPad now will actually support a mouse too as of iOS 13. You can use Bluetooth mouse with it too. For anybody who cares about that tidbit.
Okay, yeah, we have another question. There's some comments, but I think this one is a question. So it may be a bit late for this, but I want to prevent existing programs that use DB2 Connect from breaking. How would I add IBM DB2 back to that environment?
Alan, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, check with us. It's not available in the community. The IBM DB2 is not in the community PHP. We built it. Here's Seiden Group. We built it. So that's a chat with us. We do some extra services, but this is not a commercial talk. So just email me about it if you want.
Okay. So thank you.
Well, so I just wanted to show for those who are curious about the Apache config, and I think that link that you posted of Kings has some of this on there already, Alan. But just to show you, it's basically you've got pretty much a stock HTTP config with a couple things that you load. So if you look at here, there's a service program for fast CGI that gets loaded. You set the document root. I use the Zend Server port. I think 10,080 was their port. So I used it on my sample server. And then there's a couple things that you put in here for script aliases to include PHP pages in your config. And then these two guys. So this for my HTML and PHP pages to be served up, and this for any of the fast CGI components that run. And that's the core, pretty basic configuration. And then there's a fast CGI configuration file, I think, which is what Alan talked about earlier. That looks just like this. There's a couple lines that you put in there. And once you've done that, you've essentially enabled PHP on your Apache server. And then obviously we're not covering Nginx, but it's somewhat similar. One of the nice things about Nginx that's cool is that it supports SSL. Alan might know this too, but arguably I found Nginx much easier to set up for SSL. So I think Alan made a comment about being able to proxy, and which that means like if you have a non-secure server, you can hide it behind SSL port using something like Nginx. They call it a proxy server, but it's a good way to have all these unprotected servers that sit on the eye, but not open them up to the outside world. But when you want to open them up to the outside world, you can put SSL on the front end of those so they are secure without having to do a bunch of IBM configuration. Because I know there's sometimes some pain with setting up certificate manager and things like that on I, which you can bypass if you use something like Nginx. I think I stated that correctly, right, Alan?
Yes, very good, Richard.
Cool. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll leave you with just one last look. Alan showed this earlier, but this is where the ODBC ini file lives, and you'll see, just like you showed in his slides, it's pretty much, this gets auto-configured when you install the IBM iAccess driver. And so it has this already in there by default. So just by installing the IBM iAccess driver and then using localhost and star local for a data source name, you can get connectivity without having to specify user IDs and passwords in your connections.
Oh, there is another question. Nginx engine, I'm not sure how to pronounce that now, still supports certificates, doesn't it? Oh, my brain's getting tired.
Yeah, no, Nginx uses standard SSL certificates.
Just the pronunciation there, Nginx, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, Alan, do you know what that acronym stands for? I guess I've never even looked it up.
I never did either. I just thought it sounded cool, and I stopped there.
Yep, me too.
And let's see, you're still going?
Did you want to? No, I'm pretty much done. Alan, did you want to take it back and do our wrap up?
I'll take it back. Just have a couple of more slides. Just a minute. Okay.
Okay, while you're doing that, we have another question came up. So are you saying that DB2 functions aren't in the community PHP? So for us old timers, we moved our stuff from i5 Connect to DB2 Connect, then to ODBC Connect. And commands, correct? You might want to read that.
That's
that makes
correct.
Sense.
That's correct. Yeah, you can hear me. Yeah, in the free community edition, now it's another migration. Yeah, there's commercial ways to get the DB2 functions, but basically it's ODBC. I remember i5 Connect. I remember that toolkit. I was there too. Yeah, I see what you said. Yeah, the community PHP, exactly. It's true. That's the way it is. So that's the way it is.
Okay.
Correct. That's answering Chris. Yep. Okay. Anything else? So let me just go on support options because people are interested. This community support options, so you can get the PHP version updates from the repository. The River site, which I give a link to here, midrange.com. I've got the correct.com there, link there. There's also paid ones, so people who want paid ones, Perforce or Zend has one. I think they call it like Zend PHP Enterprise. I think it's the RPM plus some extra things. I don't know exactly what they are. And break fix support, call them to get things back up. Seiden Group does the same thing. We have those extra extensions for compatibility with what you were used to, and break fix support also. IBM TSS has break fix open source support as well. They offer contracts in that. So, and there may be others I don't know about. So I'm just trying to give you the options I know about. So you have options there as well as the community support that I mentioned, those links there. And that's it, just contact information here. You will get all the slides. Write to us, check out those forums. I do a newsletter every month when I get to it that has just community free stuff in it that you might like. Richard's active out there. Anything else before we let you have your dinner?
Okay. Alex asked if there'll be a recording. Usually the weekend after the meetings, I put the recordings out there on the Magic website. And I think earlier I put the password in the chat. It's going to be magic-IBMI.
Great. I want to thank all of you who attended, pioneers at open source and IBMI, and Richard and Laura. Thanks so much for everything you do to keep this group going. It's just great to see the support we're seeing here from attendees.
Thank you. Yep. So, yep. I think that's everything. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. And you can also go to the Magic website and get our newsletters. And then of course you'll see me posting stuff on LinkedIn all the time. So.
Fantastic. Thank you.